ahead of a major election year.
You're going to see a fight.
Questions about election security.
We're simply reviewing whether these counties had controls in place.
Voter access and election laws.
Is it worth the cost, do you think?
Are taking center stage. We dive into state elections on this episode of Inside Kansas Politics. You're taking a look inside Kansas politics. Welcome in. I'm Rebecca Chung. Today we're looking at where the state's election system stands. What could change ahead of 2024? Joining me now is political analyst Bob Beatty, executive director of the ACLU of Kansas, Micah Kubik, and political science professor Michael Smith. Now, thank you all for joining us. We're going to kick off today's discussion with a look at the latest election security audit that came out. Now, this is the final part of an audit on last year's election. The item in question was whether Kansas has practices that support election security and accuracy when it comes to counting votes. Auditors reviewed 15 of the state's 105 counties, selected based on location, the number of voters, and the types of voting machines used. They found that none of the counties had adequate written election security policies or guidance. They say the issues they identified could be tied to insufficient guidance and oversight at the state and county level.
What we kind of expected going into this is that counties would have comprehensive, unified, regularly updated policy and procedure manuals that captured what the county election officer expected in terms of security controls that should be in place. And we found that none of the counties we reviewed had that.
Our office has continually and will even more so provide white papers and examples of best practices that we receive from federal agencies, but there's not a single list that everyone agrees is, if you do this, you're going to be absolutely secure.
A spokesman from the Secretary of State's office says they plan to look at additional rules and regulations ahead of 2024 to increase the safety of the state's elections. Bob, let's start with you. What are your thoughts on the findings from this audit, and should there be more written controls in place, at least when it comes to looking at things on the county level?
Well, I hate to be too, let's step back and look at the global view, but we have to think about what elections in America are, and we have to think about federalism, which is throughout United States history, Americans have wanted to put elections in the hands of local authorities. Because actually, get this, many Americans throughout American history feared a powerful central government. They actually did not want a huge overlord running elections because they feared, well, that person could, manipulate an election and just do a couple things and all of a sudden the results are skewed. So they wanted the local level. So think about local school boards with education. So what that means is that in Kansas, all these counties are in charge of their own elections. And the idea is they know what's going on, and under the terms of federalism, Michael can chip in later, they know what's best for their county. So now in the last few years, of course, we've had people saying, oh, the elections may not be secure. So are we going to go toward having sort of universal policies and having more control by the state? We could. Even having more control by the federal government? We could. But we have to understand that there's this balance, and that at the county level, they're running their own elections, and they may have different practices that work best for their county. But one thing we can get into later is if we are going to demand that these counties do things a certain way, they're going to need some money, they're going to need resources in order to do that.
And Michael, you wanted to weigh in on this as well, right?
Well, of course, I agree with Bob. No surprise there, except for one thing. Never apologize for being a political scientist. Of course, we look at the big picture. You asked about written regulations, Rebecca, and I would push back a little bit on that. Maybe, but I really think it's a training issue. So much of our election work is ultimately done either by volunteers or by people who are only paid a token amount, the same way you get for jury duty. And rural counties are even more stressed. There's no evidence, shout this from the rooftops please, there's no evidence of any widespread election fraud in Kansas, period, including in this audit. These are technical mistakes, a lot of chain of custody things about ballots and the voting machines themselves. And it really comes down to the training of the election workers and the poll workers. So rather than more written regulations, I would put the emphasis more on training. And I do agree also funding. Let's pay people and pay them well so we have professionals doing this.
Michael, you're right on that. Auditors did say that their findings don't necessarily mean that Kansas elections aren't secure. So they say following the best practices takes money and resources that some counties, especially smaller ones, may not have. For example, they found that a large county could have 2,000 pieces of equipment and 150 polling places. That's compared to a smaller county with 5 pieces of equipment and 1 polling place. Micah, what's your take on this? We know that the ACLU came out with a survey in, I think it was March, about how voter access is one of the main issues for voters. How could some of those differences between smaller and larger counties factor into that?
So I want to agree that one of the main findings of this audit was that there is no basis for any of these claims about fraudulent elections or for a lack of election integrity. I think what the audit really underlined once again is that the biggest issue confronting Kansas elections is making sure that every eligible citizen who wants to vote is able to do so. And the biggest issue is about expanding voter access, making sure that we have policies in place, including at the local level, that guarantee high voter turnout. We at the ACLU put out a report just a few weeks ago about local election policies, pointing out that every county gets to set its own policies. Many counties take steps that encourage voter participation and voter turnout, and many do not. And there really is not as much of a correlation between the size of the county and the size of the budget as folks might imagine. There are lots of small counties that do lots of things, like expanding early voting and making sure that polling places are small, all of which we know lead to higher voter turnout. And then there are larger counties that have more resources that choose not to do those things. That's not to say that money isn't an issue. It is instead about priorities and what local election officials decide is most important to strengthen democracy in their own communities.
Michael, Bob, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, there's trade-offs here, and you're talking about expanding voter turnout, and that has been sort of the goal for 20, 30, 40 years. But in the past few years, we've had some voices that say, no, expanding turnout, I'm not so concerned about that. We want 100% security, and that's the overriding goal, but that can, of course, suppress turnout because it can lead to regulations or getting rid of things, which I think we'll talk about later, like drop boxes and other things, with this goal of having 100% security that then can suppress turnout. So I think what we're seeing is some forces that are pushing back against this idea. I happen to think turnout is good for a democracy and the more people that vote, and can be some trade-offs that might occur. But I think one of the problems has been in the last few years of some people saying, I'm not concerned about turnout, I'm just obsessed with this 100% security.
And if I could jump in here, I push back a little on both sides. On the one hand, there's actually not a lot of evidence that things like limiting drop boxes or limiting early voting days lowers voter turnout all that much, and there's virtually none that ever changes the outcome of an election. If it does, it tends to affect Democrats and Republicans about equally. It may lower turnout a little, same thing with voter ID. My concern is that it feeds a narrative about voter fraud that ultimately leads to things like the insurrection attempt on January 6th. I think that's the bigger threat. Lying about election security feeds a very dangerous narrative. Now, if voters have to reorient their plans to go to a different location for a drop box or come back and vote tomorrow, most voters do that. A few don't, and there's some issues with disabled accessibility and so forth. And that's important. But the bigger issue, I think, is feeding this narrative, and I say we put a stop to it.
All right, thank you all. When we come back, we're taking a look at election laws in Kansas and what state election officials say is sabotaging elections. We'll be right back. You're taking a look inside Kansas politics.
The story of Grace Med has always been told through its people, both those who serve and those who it is our honor to serve. We meet at the intersection of compassion and vulnerability, bringing health where there was illness and hope where there was despair. Our patients come to us bearing the weight of living in the margins, and we share the love of Jesus Christ with them by providing compassionate quality health care for all their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. Because health restored is always hope renewed. Find hope today by scheduling an appointment with Grace Med.
There's comfort and more than enough room for your family, friends, and furry companions to happily go along for the ride in the Atlas. 2023 Volkswagen Atlas and Atlas Cross Sport models now 3.9% APR for up to 72 months.
it's the service. It was very personal from the moment we got in there.
I know there's a lot of options, but it's always been Crown.
If you're a potential student and you're thinking about where to go for college and you're trying to decide, why would I go to Washburn? I can tell you, people are going to know you. You're going to sit in classes with people and professors who know who you are and know what your dreams are and help you achieve those dreams. And one of the things that is so unique about Washburn University is that we have a pathway. No matter what your educational goal or dream is, we have a place here for you. You belong at Washburn.
Vanderbilt's summer savings event is going on now. Our best-selling Carhartt pocket tees are in stock for summer, also available in big and tall sizes. Save $50 on Wolverine waterproof Rancher boots, only $99.99. Check out our great selection of new arrival Hey Dude, Wendy, and Wally styles. 3 popular Ariat pull-on work boots, all at one great price. Your choice, $159.99.
Work Boot Center, Vanderbilt.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. I'm Rebecca Chung here with a team of experts to answer questions on state elections. Next year, we're expecting a presidential preference primary, which could cost taxpayers millions. So still, one of the main arguments in favor of this was voter access. Instead of political party caucuses, we'll have a state-run primary. And when we spoke with the Secretary of State, he said parties can choose whether people who are not in their party can participate in this. But so far, it looks like voters will have to register under a party to participate. Bob, we've talked about this before, but this idea of increasing voter access when it comes to this law, what are your thoughts on it? What should people know about this new primary?
I've been on record as saying the caucuses in Kansas are actually ridiculous because they were the Democrats, for example, in the past they had to be there for 2 hours, caucusers, and just to vote in a primary election for a presidential candidate. I called it sometimes political hostage taking because it went on for so long. So the caucus was really not a good idea in Kansas. It really only works in Iowa where they actually really turn out. However, they're moving to a primary in Kansas. That's very exciting. I love presidential elections and presidential politics. However, what I'm not happy about is that independents or unaffiliateds are not allowed to vote in this primary. Now, the pushback against me is, well, yes, they can vote. They just have to, change their party identification that day. Well, think about it, everybody. You're not an unaffiliated or independent voter if you've just changed to a party. So they really are not allowed to vote, unaffiliateds. So I'm disappointed in that. A number of states do allow unaffiliateds. So if you are unaffiliated and you really want to vote in the presidential primary, you can switch your party preference, but as soon as you do that, you are now a Democrat or Republican. If you want to stay unaffiliated, you will not be allowed to vote in the March 19th presidential primary for either Republican or Democrat in the state of Kansas.
This actually does change the outcome of elections, as you know, Bob. For example, in 2016, the caucus winners in Kansas were Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders. Now, why was that? Well, a lot of it is because caucuses reward people with a smaller base, but much more dedicated. People that are willing to sit through a 2-hour-long meeting, often held on a Saturday.
And it's wild. Caucuses in Kansas, at least, would only get about, no joke, 9 or 10% of all the registered voters in their party. I hope for Kansas that the primary gets upwards of 30 to 40, and in some political heaven, 50%. That would be nice.
And Michael, we also had several other election bills that were discussed this year. Some made it over the finish line, some did not. One of the proposals was to get rid of the 3-day grace period for mail-in ballots. This bill failed to pass, but many of the debates were centered around increasing voter confidence in elections. How do these conversations factor into the legislation lawmakers are looking at?
Well, here again, we have a law that is not necessary. There's zero evidence that allowing a grace period undermines the election security in any way whatsoever. But on the other hand, it's not probably going to lower voter turnout all that much because many people who vote early do so way in advance, sometimes weeks in advance. I think if anything with early voting, the bigger issue is how to do political campaigns, because by the time you knock on somebody's door, a lot of those people have already voted. So we see this a lot. that the Republicans will advance laws that are not necessary, but the Democrats often will exaggerate their harms. As I say, I think the biggest harm is feeding a narrative that elections are not secure when they are. But in terms of voter turnout, I don't think this law is necessary. I don't know if it's going to change any election results.
Now, we also spoke with the Secretary of State about Kansas elections. He says that claims about election security and fraud can sometimes hurt both parties. Here's what he had to say.
And it really hurts the Republicans the most. You know, if Democrats are out talking voter suppression, their base doesn't turn out. If Republicans are talking voter fraud, their base doesn't turn out. So their language, the Republican language, is what is basically disappointing the Republican turnout. My hope is that finally goes away and realize, so you're attacking your neighbors.
I think the Secretary is right that this narrative is not helpful to anyone. Attacking the integrity of our elections is not helpful. Attacking democracy itself is not helpful. What I think we really should be focused on, though, are the steps that we can take to affirmatively increase voter turnout. I believe that democracy is strongest when more people participate, and I think Kansans believe that every eligible citizen who wants to cast a ballot should be able to do so. We should be taking the steps that we know do that, and we know that things like expanding early voting, even if it does only at the margins. We know in Kansas, for example, most counties don't offer a single hour of early voting in person outside of Monday through Friday normal business hours. And yet we know that the counties that do that have much higher turnout than those that don't.
All right, things are heating up. After the break, we're getting answers to where voter access stands in Kansas. We'll tell you what the latest report says. We'll be right back. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
There is just something special about summertime here in Kansas. For over 50 years, Lewis Toyota has been there to help you enjoy all your summer activities. Thank you for trusting Lewis Toyota as your local dealer, and we look forward to serving you in the future.
Thank you for letting us be a part of your community.
I'm not coming out until Casey's has thin crust.
One thin crust?
You have no idea how much this means to my son.
Hey, bud. Casey's finally has thin crust.
Party cut with a touch of sea salt.
He's finally coming down.
Casey's did it, Dad!
Thin Crusters, the wait is over. Casey's new light and crispy thin crust is here.
The 27 News Storm Tracker is sponsored by D.L. Smith Electric, bringing your vision to life. Don't miss Dinosaur World Live, February 15th at 6 at the Topeka Performing Arts Center. Tickets available at the TPAC box office or Ticketmaster.com. The 27 News Storm Tracker is sponsored by Wilson Tire.
When you're on a motorcycle, you got to look out for all kinds of stuff. But after a crash, it's a danger you can't see that can really get you.
The insurance company is working behind the scenes to deny you compensation.
They're building a case against you. But at Devon James, we're working for you.
Keep your head on a swivel. Let these guys look out for you. Motorcycle crash, Devon James wins. Call or text 888-8888.
Weather facts you didn't know you wanted to know.
So much water is released from the leaves of corn plants that it makes the air surrounding cornfields quite a bit more humid, and a phenomenon known as corn sweat. Now you know.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. I'm Rebecca Chung. Questions about voter access have also stirred debate in Kansas. The latest report from the ACLU shows that it wildly varies across the state. Micah, that's where you come in. Now tell us a little bit about some of the key findings from that report.
So the key finding of this report is that there is a patchwork quilt of policies at the county level in Kansas. There are 105 counties in Kansas, and every one of them runs their elections differently. In a lot of respects, that's a wonderful thing, allowing for local control. But what also happens is that individual counties then do not take steps to increase voter turnout. And so you have a huge variation in the size of polling locations, which contributes to long lines that discourage people from voting. You have different policies around the number and hours of early voting. You have different policies around curbside voting for folks with disabilities, which is actually state law to be required, but many counties in practice don't do it. And then you have a number of counties that have very diverse populations but make no materials available in languages outside of English. And what we find is that when all of those things add up, they make a big difference in how many eligible people actually participate. Each one of them is good for only a little bit of turnout, but when you add all of those policies together, you wind up with discrepancies like Johnson County having nearly 60% voter turnout in 2022, and Seward County, where liberal is, having 28% voter turnout. It's not a coincidence that Seward County doesn't really do any of the things that we identify in the report as contributing to voter turnout, and Johnson County does many of them.
Now, I understand there were also some proposals from the ACLU about how to increase voter access in the state. Let's pull those up. I'm just going to read off a few. So increasing the early voting period and the actual number of days within the period, increasing the number of early voting locations, opening the election day locations for less crowded polls, providing voting materials in languages other than English, and establishing a vote from jail program. Now, Bob, Michael, which of these do you think the legislature is most likely to take up?
Well, here's the problem right now in 2023, okay? You look at a lot of these proposals and they're, as we've been talking about, they're about helping people vote, and think about early voting. I vote early. It's wonderful. You're driving, hey, I got 15 minutes, great, I'll go to the county office and vote. So what would anybody say? What is wrong with that? Well, in 2023, what we're getting, Rebecca, is, ooh, those votes are sitting around in an office for a week and somebody's going to be in there and then taking the box. Okay, maybe it's theoretically possible. This audit shows that it's maybe in some of these smaller counties that they're not watching over this. Well, solve that problem, put some resources toward it, so this is not happening. But don't just say, like in some states across the United States, oh, no early voting. That's not the solution. The solution is to work with your group or some other groups and say, we want people to vote early. Here's some things we can do. How can we appease those who are worried about, the security? But what we're seeing in other states, and I hope we don't see it in Kansas, is, let's just not have it. It's too spooky. We have had at least one legislator that I heard say, well, people just need to vote on Election Day. I heard, somebody said that. And I don't think that's the answer. I think it's working with groups to figure out solutions, as you were talking about.
And Mike, I wanted to give you a chance to talk as well about any proposals that you're looking at for next year.
So I think, first of all, we should say that even if these policies don't advance voter turnout, and I think they do, they send the right signal, right? They send a signal about making sure that everyone's voice is heard, that we're holding our elected officials accountable. I would really encourage folks to be in touch with their local election official, someone that a lot of folks don't, frankly, spend a whole lot of time thinking about, their county clerk or their election commissioner, that has a lot of discretion over these things. They are the ones who decide how many precincts there will be, how many days of early voting they will use up to the maximum allowed by state law. And so if we just got consistency or even enhancement within what is already permitted by state law, I think we would go a long way towards sending a signal that we believe in democracy, we want people to be included, and we boost voter turnout at the margins too.
All right, we'll be right back. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
The latest devices are here, and you will not believe the sound quality. Because we want what's best for you, New Sound is offering a never-before trade-in, trade-up event. Let your current hearing aids save you money.
The Holton WeatherCam is sponsored by Ellis Boys, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram.
You think knowledge is a powerful weapon? Here, you'll have plenty of ammo. We turn intelligence into tactical success. Explore more than 200 careers at GoArmy.com.
The story of Grace Med has always been told through its people, both those who serve and those who it is our honor to serve. We meet at the intersection of compassion and vulnerability, bringing health where there was illness and hope where there was despair. Our patients come to us bearing the weight of living in the margins, and we share the love of Jesus Christ with them by providing compassionate quality health care for all their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. Because health restored is always hope renewed. Find hope today by scheduling an appointment with Grace Med.
Hi folks, Rodney Robertson with Window Design and Remodeling. We recently constructed this addition on this home and added this beautiful deck. We removed the back wall and added 300 square feet of kitchen and dining area. Just look at the difference from before to after. Call Window Design and Remodeling today or visit our website, We are your home remodeling specialists.
Don't miss the ACT Theater Company's presentation of Petticoat Government, July 21st through the 30th at the Elmont United Methodist Church in Topeka. If you love KU and K-State sports, you'll love K-Nation. Go to our K-Nation Facebook page and add to the conversation on all the news surrounding the Jayhawks and Wildcats. Join us on Facebook today.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics, where we're getting answers on state elections. Now, for the final part of today's discussion, let's talk about what lawmakers could focus on ahead of 2024. Bob, let's start with you. What could we see make a comeback next year?
A comeback. Well, I'd like to see lawmakers work with the Secretary of State, who would then work with county officials, given that the audit results. What do they need to increase turnout, to get their security scores higher, and what can the state do, maybe in terms of resources or just materials to do that? Work together rather than just saying, okay, we want to get rid of something or X, Y. Actually work together to increase turnout, but also make sure that people are satisfied with security at the local level.
And Michael, Micah, really quick, any thoughts on what we could expect next year or what you're hoping to see come up?
What I would expect them to do is what they did this year, which is try and undermine and attack voting rights. What I'd like them to do instead is explore things like automatic voter registration and election day registration, two tools that have been used in dozens of other states now that have a proven record of boosting both voter registration and voter turnout, making democracy stronger.
And this is a bit of a niche issue, but it's important. Kansas should participate in the ERIC system. ERIC is voter security done right. States sharing information about change of address at the post office, voter registrations, and death certificates to update their voter rolls. There is a conspiracy theory. It is completely baseless on social media. Claims that ERIC has something to do with George Soros. It has nothing to do with George Soros. It is nonpartisan. It is election security done right. Kansas should participate in ERIC.
And that was your look inside Kansas politics. If you want to keep up to date on all things Kansas politics, then follow us on social media. Follow us on Twitter at @InKansasPolitics and on Facebook. Just search Inside Kansas Politics. We'll also post the full video on YouTube. Just search KSNT News and check ksnt.com/inside-kansas-politics for past episodes. If you have a story you want Kansas state legislators to hear or topics you think we should cover, let us know. You can email us at ikp@ksnt.com. And we have a programming note for you. Inside Kansas Politics will not air on July 23rd due to NBC's live coverage of the 151st Open Championship. Inside Kansas Politics will return on July 30th. We'll see you right here, same time, same place. Have a good day.